Okay. All right, should we start?
Oh,
Okay. Thank you everyone for coming. And I'm going to turn things over to Sergey as quickly as possible because no one wants to hear from me. But I'd just like to know how many of you have heard his podcast or the podcast by Carol. How do you
Cadwallader. It's
Cadwallader?
it's a Welsh surname, so you
Yeah.
you you pronounce it Cadwallader.
I'm sorry, I didn't see the show of hands because a lot of people are um so if I don't see your video, could you let me know with a thumbs up or something like that? Okay, so pretty much everyone does know this story. You don't need me to summarize it. You don't need a quick introduction. I'm just Sergei was pitched by a Russian from the embassy who shouldn't have been pitching him, and he tried to bring it to the attention of the relevant authorities, and the relevant authorities seemed uninterested. And it subsequently came to his attention that indeed this was a spy trying to pitch him to penetrate the Conservative Party, and no one did anything about it. Does that seem like a fair summary, Sergey?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. That puts Sergey in a good position to talk to us about Russian intelligence operations in the UK and what they mean and what should be done now. And I'm going to turn things over to Sergey with a question. Do you think the West is ready to accept the reality of Russian intelligence operations now?
Well, I think it links also directly to the question of we're at war in Russia, and I'll explain why. Um, I think interestingly, because actually before I start on that, I just wanted to thank everybody who managed to help or read about my research at university, because it's kind of it led from this story. Because I also whistle blew on basically Western investments, Western asset managers supporting the Putin regime up to the point of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And I think there is a growing realization, if some of you read the latest book by Anne Applebaum, Autocracy Inc., is that autocracies work increasingly together, regardless of their ideologies, when their interests collide, to help each other. I mean, we saw it with oil tankers, being Chinese oil tankers being used to help Russia, cut various undersea cables, which is a huge issue for the maritime command of NATO at the moment. And I think we still don't realize that we can't really just focus on Russia or Iran or North Korea separately within our foreign policy in order to confront this growing threat. We have to really approach Autocracy Inc., as one entity. So we can't really have divergence of policy between those various countries, otherwise it's going to be ineffective. So, and one of the elements of this, which I have been researching, thank you very much for Claire for the link to my fundraiser, because I'm a novice in these things. I came from financial services industry, so I don't know how you get grants and so on. I'm just kind of finding my way and been spending my own money on it. And I'm looking at asset managers. So I mean, for example, basically my little topic, which is going to be part of the larger topic as I go into my doctorate, would be the how Western investments in oppressive regimes damage the national security of democratic countries where we live. We basically keep the investments in the economy kind of separate from foreign policy, which I think is a huge mistake. And we equip oppressive regimes then who attack us using our money, using the proceeds from the trade with us, against us. So it kind of it leads into, I think, this question about our war in Russia, because I'm just trying to kind of cover the ground of how we got here. It was, of course, due to our own mistakes, not only in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of how we structured our foreign trade and investment. I think whilst I was working on my thesis, my supervisor is from Turkey, which helps because he knows about autocratic regimes. And interestingly, we found some amazing parallels between the sort of recent history of Turkey and Russia. Both of the regimes kind of turned in terms of their stance towards the West in about 2008. And curiously enough, in 2007, there was this article published by the chairman of the military experts panel of the Russian International Affairs Council, which is a very influential think tank, very close to the president's administration of Putin, the Kremlin. It was a retired major general called Alexander Vladimirov, who wrote about modern wars and how they're fought at the level of consciousness and ideas. You know, what we basically, it's kind of soft power plus, you know, so you're almost like going back in time and think about how Soviet Union ideologized, sorry, I can't pronounce it properly, put ideology at the front of the soft power. You know, all those traditional values, etc. But also he talked about the good old active measures, which basically he basically said that you know, we should really put active measures back into the kind of center of our strategy, grand strategy towards Western democracies. And in fact, you know, people think that what Russia is doing now, it's very modern and it's a new development. In fact, it's not actually, because this kind of strategy been employed, if you remember, in the Second World War by, you know, Office of Special Operations in, now I always confuse them. It was a, yeah, Special Operations Executive, SOE, was in the UK, and the US Strategic Services, which was a, you know, before the CIA, was in the US. But those kind of techniques were used during the war. And then the Soviet Union developed them, the sort of active measures, which included, you know, various covert operations to do with interference, political interference, funding groups, even, you know, in Soviet days, supporting terrorist organizations, etc.
Sergei, excuse me for interrupting. Yeah. Can I ask everyone to mute themselves if they're not speaking? Go ahead. Excuse me.
And then basically, what's interesting was that from that article, elements of that article were taken and kind of taken on a level higher by someone who has become very famous thanks to a monograph which was written by Mark Galeotti, who is now advisor to British Foreign Secretary, called Marshal, or General at that point he was, Valery Gerasimov, you know, what is now known as the Gerasimov Doctrine. And he published that article, who was the chief of the general staff. So he was like, you know, how can I put it? Maybe head ideologue of the Russian army, one of the, you know, top people of the Russian army. In 2013, so just a year before, or several months before the invasion of Crimea, but the draft was done actually before the Orange Revolution. So some people say, oh, it's just a reflection of Orange Revolution. But basically he outlined, and I'm kind of probably want to just to quote, that the very rules of war have changed. The role of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals have grown, and in many cases, they have exceeded the power of force of weapons in their offensiveness. And they're just supplemented by military means of concealed character. And there was this chart. He presented various charts at his presentation at the Russian Ministry of Defense. There was a third Moscow Conference of International Security, and there was a huge two boxes basically. One was called Concealed Use of Military Force. And there was also a box, interestingly, Search for Creation of Pretext for Military Operation. So first they used it in Ukraine, but interestingly, I think the origins of it were actually in the Western successful attempt. How can I say? No, wasn't successful. It was a victory in the Cold War. Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And they learned from it. You know, Russians are very good at stealing Western ideas, but they amplify them in a sort of inhumane way.
You have muted yourself. I cannot hear you.
I think it's my mobile is playing up. So I
I
haven't
lost you
touched anything.
about 20 seconds ago. Do you
Oh, I'm
mind?
so sorry about that.
No, not at all. I'm sure
It's
it's my
probably the
fault.
The Russians finally got onto me.
Yeah.
Because I haven't touched anything. So anyway, so I'll say again. So I think what basically happened is the Russians are very good at stealing things. So
Yes,
they
perfect.
stole, yeah. So they basically made they looked very closely at how the West defeated the Soviet Union in the Cold War and how the West successfully used soft power and various other means, and they weaponized it in a way that only an autocracy can, in a sort of inhumane way, making it even more effective. So I think that's what really happened. It's not a brand new approach. I think it's rooted, this active, modern active measures and political interference. It's rooted in the Cold War, in the way that warfare was conducted in the Second World War, but also um, also in what the Russians learned from what they perceived as a successful application by the West of soft power and various weapons kind of connected to it. So when we say that are we at war with Russia, from our perspective, I don't know what type of analysis the U.S. Ministry of Defense or NATO is using to see whether we're at war with any country, but from the Russian perspective, according to the Gerasimov doctrine, we are at war because those elements which traditionally were only used, to soften up the enemy, as we know, with leaflets, etc., during the Second World War. The Russia now uses it as the cheapest, in terms of grand strategy. Grand strategy is all about, using the cheapest means to achieve your strategic goals. It's espionage and covert operations have always been much cheaper than using military means. So for them, it's a more effective way of achieving those goals, and they are part of the war plan. So if we're asking ourselves, would, in Russians' eyes, are we at war with Russia? The West is NATO with war with Russia. The answer is absolutely categorically, we are, because they're already conducting that war as per Gerasimov doctrine.
How can we persuade Western publics that this is the case?
Well, also, I mean, that, for example, in the case of U.S. election, according to elections and Brexit, according to CIA, what they've disclosed was that the part of the intelligence machinery of Russia that was engaged with the first Trump election was GRU, which is military intelligence. It's part of the Ministry of Defense.
Yeah.
So there you go.
What I'm concerned by, however, is that I see what's in front of our eyes, which is that obviously the Kremlin has some kind of control over Donald Trump. And I also know that the vast majority of Americans believe this is a conspiracy theory. And I don't know how to persuade people that no, this isn't a conspiracy theory. This is very much a well-studied, well-established reality that Russia's intelligence operations work in a particular way, that we can see their effects. How do people here have thoughts about this? Put your hand up if you do, because I'm at a loss about what to do next. We're all stumped.
Andrea, I think, was lifting her hand.
Well,
Go ahead.
Robert. Yeah, this is an interesting question because this is like in the movie Mars Attacks, where the Martians are killing people and saying, "Don't run, we are your friends." And the only difference is in the movie Mars Attacks, most people don't fall for that. Like a week ago, Trump said, Putin and I went through a lot of stuff by being accused of colluding with each other. Yeah. He said that, okay? He then cut off arms and intelligence to Ukraine and even forced commercial suppliers not to provide commercially available satellite imagery to Ukraine. They couldn't buy it on the open market. So this is not a question now of reports of secret meetings in Trump Tower or this or that. This is like, in your face, we are colluding with Russia. And yet, people still insist that it is the Russia collusion thing is a hoax.
Yes.
It might still be up there. Andrew McCarthy is a legal columnist for National Review, and he actually attacks a recent Trump move against this law firm as a bill of attainder for going after them because they pushed the Russia collusion hoax. He still calls it a hoax. It's just legally incorrect that he's going at them now because it wasn't a crime when they did it. But
Someone
there's
like
something
Andrew
wrong
McCarthy,
here
an
about
intelligent man. Arun?
people insisting on not believing what they're seeing.
Yeah.
No, Claire, I just have a question. You said the majority of Americans believe that there is no collusion between Trump and the Russians.
I don't know if it's a majority, but a very significant number.
That's not, listen, I think it cleaves down partisan lines. I mean,
Yeah,
Trump's
perhaps.
a MAGA base certainly
Right.
believes anything he says on that, but I don't believe that's the case at all with, people who don't like Trump, who are more numerous than those who do.
Yeah, you're probably right about that.
No,
But
I think that the question is, and if we go back to the 2016 election, was did it make a difference? I mean, personally, I believe that there's collusion. I mean, but I don't know if I don't think it really affected the result of the election. I could be wrong about that. I think that's where the difference is. But
Sergei, you said you had some thoughts about the election to come, but Kay's hand is up, so I'm going to let you decide who to call on.
I don't mind. Please do, because you know your it's your club. You know people here.
A lot
My
of
first
people,
time.
Kay, please.
So my question is, certainly our own intelligence agencies are well aware of what's been going on. So why is there no reveal, factual, evidential reveal from our own agencies?
Well, I think I can offer some thoughts about that, but let's stick with Sergei's subject of expertise first and ask Sergei, what would it take to get the UK to do a proper review of the evidence that they've, as they've never done?
Well, I may first volunteer my thoughts on Trump, and they're not obviously based on any specific inside knowledge of coming from the intelligence services, obviously. But from what I know, and I've been interested in, history of intelligence for a long time, and also Oleg Gordievsky, the famous, how can I say, the famous KGB colonel who, for 11 years, was the West's most important intelligence source in the 70s and 80s. Has been my friend for a very long time. We had lots of conversations. I read all his books, obviously, and I keep in touch with Chris Andrew, who co-wrote books with Gordievsky, who is a retired professor now at Cambridge and official historian of MI5. I think Russian intelligence always had different categories of agents. One, which is kind of more familiar to everybody, would be just a proper agent, person who would have access to secret information, and normally they would have a case officer, person who looks after transmission of those documents and looks after the welfare, helps with the welfare of the agent. And there was another category, which were sort of like sources of information, or they were agents of influence. So they would not necessarily have a case officer all the time. Sometimes they would go, be put on ice due to their, career going in different directions or whatever for many years. We know from what's been revealed in Czech intelligence, because as we know, in contrast to KGB archives, which have never been fully opened, After Warsaw Pact countries, that camp fell apart, actually the Czechs opened up all the intelligence archives, and the files are available for inspection, unredacted, amazingly. And we know that Ivana Trump has been in contact with the Czech intelligence all this time, when she married Trump, and they followed her very closely. I also know a researcher at King's College who's recently published a book about Czech intelligence and terrorist organizations. And when I was talking to her, she basically said that, in every government department in the Czech Republic, there was a so-called advisor, representative from Soviet authorities. And when she looks at the documents, all the reports on Czech intelligence reports were all copied to the advisor. So KGB, even if they were not taking active interest, they knew everything that was going on. So I'm sure they knew about Trump, because then we know that his first trip in 1987 to Moscow was actually managed by the KGB. So although he didn't have secret access to secret documents at the time, because he was just a businessman, the first time he had access was when he was elected president, first time. I think the Soviets were keen to exploit what this Trump could offer, and clearly when Putin came to power, he also, as we all know, had a very close relationship with organized crime. That was from his St. Petersburg days, which of course had an international dimension to it. When we hear Trump saying things like, he trusts Putin, psychologically, I ask a question: why would he trust anybody? And the question, and I don't think it would just be because Putin flattered him at press conferences. I think it's because of his long-established relationship with Russians. We know that, for example, various Russian criminals, bought, his houses. They rented his apartments at Trump Tower. When they bought, there was somebody who bought the house, paid more money than he was supposed to. Then we know about this case when, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, when the Trump organization was facing big financial problems and American banks refused to lend him. Then there was, for example, a bank in Iceland that lent him some money, offered him a lifeline, and as far as we could make out, it was a Russian-owned bank. As we know, there was quite a big problem with Icelandic banks being owned by Russians. I also heard from my contact in the due diligence industry that apparently Trump dealt with some criminal elements in Canada, which were Russian organized crime in Canada. So I think it was a business-based relationship. We know how corrupt the construction sector is, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. So I would say it was a fusion of the KGB, organized crime under Putin, and weaponizing Trump's commercial links. And then, when Putin regime realized the value of some of the populist narratives in Europe and the US, and how they can use them, weaponize them in their grand strategy, that they realized the value of Trump gradually. But they kept in touch with him. As we know, he was left-leaning in terms of his political views, Trump, and then he was kind of coaxed towards more kind of right-wing narratives, and also to be closer to the Republican Party.
I'm just curious.
You, Sergei. Just in your opinion, based on things that you've observed and what you know, on a scale of 0 to 100%, what would be your suspicion that Elon Musk is a Kremlin asset?
Well, I have a friend, Marina Litvinenko, who has a whole theory about Musk, so maybe she should be the next guest. But she knows this kind of area much more than me, and also Marsalik. So we have this amazing once trip to Munich many years ago, and we were staying with Marina's friend, who she's married to a successful German banker in Munich. And one of their houses, which they rented out, was just across the road from the Russian consulate. And Marsalik's house was across the road from that consulate in Munich. And what they have observed was this sort of, they saw that Marsalik was digging something in this house. And that was years before this whole story broke with the Russians about Marsalik. And our German friend was trying to interest local journalists in this whole thing, because she thought that Marsalik was building a tunnel into the Russian consulate. And also all these strange cars turning up, from Luxembourg and from various other places with Russians, with Luxembourg plates, and she couldn't find anybody to be interested in that story. Everybody thought she was mad. But Marina, because of that connection, she researched quite a lot into Marsalik and also into Musk. But they're all kind of, how can I say, cryptocurrency and, all those, because obviously Musk is very interested in cryptocurrency as well. Apart from being obviously how can I say, storage place for illegally gained cash, because they're all pressing for legalization of cryptocurrency, which basically means that if you legalize various cryptocurrencies, then all your billions that you poured into cryptocurrency are going to be legal as well. You'll be able to spend them without anywhere, accept it anywhere. It's like, successfully washed dirty money. So they're on the political side, they're trying to, press for legalization of cryptocurrency. But we also know that, for example, the wonderful president of Belarus is now appearing on, I can't remember now exactly what it was. Sorry, my memory is it's not as good as it used to be when I was young. There was a podcast with this Californian guy, obviously on the Trump side, and he did it with president of Belarus. We were all talking about cryptocurrency and how wonderful it is. So, there are connections through those, I think, new industries and what they're trying to push. It's really difficult because the amounts of money involved now are staggering. Which also, there's a great fear in the UK that Musk, with his money and all those criminals, will come and take over Britain. Yeah. And even now, I saw in the Sunday Times there was an article about the latest twist in the Reform UK Party saga. Basically, their maneuverings and seeing how they can basically dislodge the Conservative Party and take over from there. Or maybe it's basically join in with the Conservative Party. So, there are lots of people in the Conservative Party and ultra-right that would love to make union with Reform UK and go from there. So I think, coming back to your question, Claire, about interference and the why we need a proper, independent, full-scale inquiry into the Russian interference in British politics, is I quite simply think that it's going to save Britain.
Yes.
Because what it would do is that it will expose everybody who took particularly illegal, foreign donations into political parties are illegal. So those convert money from Russia, because the people are still there. The source of funding won't be from Russia now. It will be probably from America, coming from Musk. But if we expose the political figures who are mostly involved and running Reform UK, and also some of the ultra-right Brexiteers in the Conservative Party who took that cash, you would remove at least those people from the political spectrum. Hopefully they'll get prosecuted as well. We don't know, but at least their reputations will be ruined. They'll be finished in politics, and that would at least offer some chance for British political parties to regroup and try to find some muscle to defend our democracy, and also the high moral ground on which I think all democracy should stand.
Andre?
Yeah, I have a question there. about the links of some of the Conservative Party in the UK to Russians, and then there is this figure, Alexander Lebedev. How significant is his connection to Boris Johnson and yeah, his father and all that stuff? He got a peerage, right?
Yeah, so the father was the former KGB officer, but although of course people say that once you're in KGB, always KGB, and the son is a kind of a playboy who moved to England, and his father arranged for him to buy three newspapers. So it was Independent, Evening Standard, I think 2 newspapers, right? Might have been the third one. It was called The Eye. Oh, The Eye was part of Independent, I think. And then he was elevated by Boris Johnson, the son, was elevated into the House of Lords. And that was just before the Russia report by the Intelligence Security Committee was published. So there were all these questions, did Boris Johnson delay that report to, not just to win the election, but also to elevate Lebedev against, actually, as we know, there were leaked objections from the security service, but they were overruled by Downing Street to elevate Lebedev into the House of Lords. I mean, in England, once you are a member of any club, whether it's House of Lords or, you're a donor of the Conservative Party, the tradition dictates that you're protected, once you are admitted into a club, because that, your exposure will not be positive for the reputation of the club. So that's why, they will close, the logic how it works. I don't have to explain to you. So maybe, that was part of the reason why he wanted to be in the House of Lords. He doesn't attend any hearings. He doesn't take part in any committees. So, And Lebedev, in terms of his financial links with Boris Johnson, I mean, we would like to know. Boris Johnson has always been very flippant with money. He never really had any money because although he earned money, but, he doesn't really know. He's almost as chaotic with money as he is with his own personal appearance. So, and I think, and we also, I mean, there's so many things you can go around digging. I mean, for example, remember once, it was total coincidence. I remember once running into Boris Johnson outside the Carlton Club, and he asked me whether I knew where this particular hedge fund manager lived, which apparently was just, as he said, at the top of the Carlton Club. And then I started digging. Apparently that hedge fund manager was his main backer during the Brexit campaign. And he came from Australia, and his mother was Russian, and he always had links with Russia. So the Russia always pops up, interestingly, with lots of things to do with Brexit, personalities-wise.
Mm-hmm. I see a hand up that belongs to a Mr. Admin or Ms. Admin. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. But
sorry, it's Siobhan.
Siobhan.
Sorry. If I could sort of reel back a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Sergei, what's your opinion about where Aaron Banks's money really came from?
I can only kind of speak from what my personal experience was.
For the Americans in the audience, perhaps you can quickly explain why that's significant.
Oh, sorry. Aaron Banks was a large donor for one of the Brexit campaigns, and I think it was perhaps the largest donor in sort of political history here. And he was investigated partly because what was he investigated for now? But anyway, he was palling up with the Russians at the embassy, going to about a dozen lunches, being offered options on gold mines in Russia. Yeah. But in terms of the money, his companies didn't actually have the 8 million. And he was investigated to the point where the path was exhausted, and whatever money it was beyond the jurisdiction of the investigators. A lot of it was offshored. So and he has a lot of connections with Russia. He was there in February 2016, and his pal lied about that. If it was innocent, what's he lying about it for? But it's the source of the money that I'm interested in, because the trail just stopped once it got to his offshore, because the investigators did not have jurisdiction. So I'm just wondering what Sergei thinks of that, and Banks and Wigmore and that whole cabaret.
Thank you. Well, Andy Wigmore. Aaron Banks is an insurance kind of broker, businessman. And because of the nature of the business, it's structured through a very sophisticated network of offshore companies. So he is a very experienced offshore kind of business operator. And I think in the past he did have run-ins with the law. For example, I read something about British authorities investigating some of his companies were named. He had several companies that had very small differences in the name, and they were kind of used for, I think it was to do with tax fraud, but don't quote me on that.
Well, he had in Companies House, he had loads of companies also registered with very small
similar names as well.
His name,
So there was like one difference with one letter inverted or something. And I know that from my very brief period in due diligence, that's something that we looked at, looking at all the subsidiaries to see, because that's a sign that, the company, the umbrella company has been to no good. So he's a kind of very confident speaker. And also why he's so important is because if I don't know how many of the American participants in this call know, but the British political system is vulnerable in the way to money, because there are very strict rules on party campaign funding. So very small, relatively small amounts of money, nothing near, kind of like a PAX that in the US, you can collect through PAX, can make a huge difference. So his donation of just £6 million to UKIP, which is now called Reform UK, was the biggest political donation in British history. And questions immediately emerged how he could afford to do that at the time, because even his house, he lives in a very grand country house, but there were lots of, if you buy a derelict country house in England, you could have bought it, even 20 years ago, very cheaply. But the house was mortgaged. So his even house was mortgaged, but he could afford to make that donation. He also, not long before, he married this Russian woman who was educated at St. Petersburg University.
Oh, she was suspected, wasn't she?
Yeah, but then she went, how can I put it? It's not terribly offensive. She was in Dubai working as entertaining American sailors. So one would suspect that maybe if she was linked with intelligence, then otherwise why would graduate of St. Petersburg University go and do that? She was maybe getting low-grade intel from those officers, and then she ended up, when she came to England, curiously enough, in another Navy centre, which is the main Navy centre in the UK, which is Portsmouth.
Yeah.
And that's how she met. Also, she knew another Russian girl who also came from St. Petersburg University. And she also lived, I think, in Portsmouth at some point. But she was also accused and she was basically, the MI5 investigated her for being a Russian spy called Zatuliveter.
She had the relationship with the Liberal
Local
Democrat MP who was 40 years older than her or something.
Yeah, and absolutely, really, really ugly and old. So, which is another. So, we can talk about it, but it's all in the podcast. But Aaron Banks Aaron Banks was interviewed by Carol Cadwallader, who did this podcast with me. And she wrote a profile for him for the one of the Observer's Sunday titles. I think it's called New Review.
Yeah.
And she was, she, and there was this whole story with the Russian embassy. So before Brexit and after he married this Russian woman, he was approached by a diplomat at a UKIP conference somewhere in the north of England. And then they ended up, him and his business partner, Andy Wigmore, ended up going to the Russian embassy for various lunches and dinners, whatever, with the Russian ambassador, etc. But we also know that the guy who, the British diplomat, a Russian diplomat who approached him at this UKIP conference was an intelligence officer, because he was the person who was named in the court case with the Zatuliveter. He was the intelligence officer who actually had dealings with the Zatuliveter.
Udod,
yeah, Alexander Udod, apparently.
Mhm.
So, and because because Aaron Banks had probably still has a gold mine somewhere in Africa.
Mhm.
I think he had a gold mine, but sorry, it's because not really my topic, but it's
Diamonds,
a
isn't it?
diamond mine. The Russian embassy then discussed with him some gold investments and also some diamond investments. Apparently, we know it from a cache of emails that's been leaked. But then he claimed that some of the money that possibly ended up as a donation to UKIP came from the proceeds of some of those diamonds that he found in that mine sold. Channel 4 television sent investigative journalists to this mine, and they came up to this derelict-looking
I
place.
remember that. I remember that.
And there was a sort of gates closed with the lock, and there was a guy on the metal chair, black guy, I think, outside, and they were asking, is anyone here? I said, no, I haven't seen anyone for years, for a long time. No one came to this mine. We, of course, know that the KGB used diamonds for various operational purposes for a long time during the Cold War. They financed terrorist groups and so on. So diamonds is an old proven currency of exchange and funding. So that wouldn't have been the first time.
I'd like to steer the
Thank you.
conversation back to more general topics, but first, Xavier, you have your hand up.
Yes, if I may, it's just a bit about Mr. Banks, and well, he had a whole constellation of companies incorporated in Gibraltar, which Gibraltar's a sort of fairly disreputable financial center, but also a center for drug smuggling and money laundering. And a very good friend of mine, with whom I was in chambers in London years ago, he left London and the barrister's chambers. This was. He went to live in Gibraltar and set up as a lawyer there. He's dead now, sadly, but he was an honest man, completely straight and honest. And he was telling me all through the Brexit thing that it was well known that Aaron Banks and his companies were laundering money like it was going out of fashion for the Russian mob, oligarchs, you name it. And in fact, my friend Stephen told me that one day a Russian oligarch walked into his office, Stephen's office, and wanted him to work on a transaction for the purchase of a jet. And he asked him, well, why have you come to me? Because you've got stacks of lawyers here, particularly those that work with Mr. Banks. And the answer was, well, this is actually a legitimate transaction for once, and we've done our research on you, and we know that you're honest. And so he was able to charge his fee, and the only gratification he got was a fairly mediocre bottle of vodka. But he said that it was so well known that banks was laundering money for the Russians through Gibraltar, that he even drew attention from the Gibraltar financial regulator, which was notoriously lax, but even they thought that he was being a bit disreputable. So I just thought I'd add that in.
That's incredible. And I think it also means that probably, if banks is to be properly investigated, that probably the investigation look beyond the presidency of Putin. So probably the 90s as well, when it's all those money started floating in. I remember I worked briefly for BBC Panorama, when was it? Early 2000. And just after that, I remember we having celebratory drinks. That must have been June or July or something, 2000. And was with my friend Michael Binion from the Times. I went to this place just across from Bush House, where World Service used to be, and run into the representative from Gibraltar. Gibraltar representative office was just on the other side of the Strand. And they were also drinking, the team. And so they knew Michael. We started chatting. And there and behold, the representative said, why won't you, Sergei and Michael, why won't you both come to Gibraltar and, we'll pay for your tickets and you write something about us. So we ended up, it was, chief minister was called Karauna, I think, as far as I remember. So we were driven around in his limo. Well, limo, it was a Volkswagen Passat. and then when we came back to London, suddenly this whole story broke about Russians and their offshore dealings through Gibraltar. And Michael, having just come back from Gibraltar, was able to write very confidently about this whole thing. And apparently he said that Caruana's office got back to him, was very angry, saying, what is all this about Russians? Because he was hoping that, because Caruana had at the time some how can I say, arguments with the Foreign Office over the future of Gibraltar, and he wanted to get the Times on his side and do some marketing for Gibraltar, how wonderful it was. And suddenly all this thing broke through about the Russians in Gibraltar.
Let me ask a question of everyone here. Is there anyone here who does not believe that Russian influence operations are an important source of Donald Trump's behavior? I'm not seeing any hands. I'm not seeing a single person who doesn't think this. Everyone here. Larissa, is that your hand?
Yeah, I certainly think that Russia is influencing, through concerted operations, the United States, and surely in ways in Trump's administration. But I guess I continue to believe, rightly or wrongly, not that he's being controlled, not that he is enacting a plan of Russia, but he's enacting a plan that is working directly in line with Russia's plans for the US, if that makes sense. In the same way that I think a lot of Americans are sincerely, kind of believe in things, including the demise of the United States, even if it's their own country, which is also in line with Russian interests without necessarily being controlled by or directed by Russian interests.
The question I asked was, I chose the word influence instead of controlled for that reason. I mean to say, do people believe that the United States and Trump in particular would be behaving as it is absent Russia's influence? Because no one here. So I don't think that I have anyone here who can serve as an example. I want to see if we can figure out what it is that's keeping people from accepting that, from believing that, and treating it as I think it is, an emergency. Because I am very perplexed by the unwillingness of large segments of the public to see, as Robert put it, what's right in front of their eyes. And I do not know where to go from here. If we can establish to our heart's content that the evidence, the preponderance of evidence suggests that this is so, but if we can't convince people to believe it. Robert, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just, this is just my feeling
Robert,
on
you
this.
had the hand up? We have two Roberts. Robert McTague, you had your hand up?
Sorry. Yeah, Robert McTague. I'll wait if the other Robert wants to speak first. It's fine.
Go ahead, Robert McTague.
Okay. I'll just tell you my feeling is it's going to take a 9/11 Pearl Harbor size incident to bring the American public on board on this. And there's too much has gone under the bridge already, because you have things like the file compromise at Mar-a-Lago and the Mueller investigation. In people's minds who don't believe those things are already proven to be falsehoods. Okay, so it's not just, oh, this thing comes up. There's a legacy now, and I think it's an even harder sell
Right.
to people. And most people don't understand. Most of the people in this room, I can tell, already understand a lot of these kinds of things on a basic level. Most ordinary Americans have no understanding of these kinds of things.
Why don't
So
they? Why has the media failed to educate them?
I don't know that the media is educated. I was in the military 25 years, and I continually was stunned at how little the media that covered us understood what we do.
Right.
Um,
Right. Andrea, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was having this discussion last night with some friends who have a lot of right-wing people in their family. And they all watch right-wing media, which is not broadcasting this information. I don't know how it can come out. I really don't. And a lot of people are naive because America's so far away from Europe, Russia. It's like, and with Trump, we're a lot more insulated. So it's really difficult to get it across to people. People think I'm like a conspiracy theorist, but everything is proven here.
But Robert, going back to your example of Andy McCarthy, who's not a stupid man, not whatsoever, and who was able to educate himself thoroughly enough to fully understand the Muslim Brotherhood and the way it ran operations in the United States. Why would someone like that be unable to understand what's going on with Russia, especially because he lived through the Cold War?
Well, it's worse than that. Let me give you a different example, which isn't public, but I won't name names. I have some ongoing discussions with high-ranking American military people, general officers. And these people were very strong supporters of defense of Ukraine under Biden, and had many pointed criticisms of how he would limit the range of the ATACMS and so forth, and why it was important that this not be done, and this and that, okay? And here comes Trump, who's much worse. And these people are fully aware of the significance for the defense of NATO, for example, if the Ukrainian army is deleted from the strategic chessboard, okay? And yet they start making up, and I have to say it, making up excuses that this is some kind of four-dimensional chess going on here. That is, they cannot believe what they are seeing because they do not want to believe what they are seeing. And I would view it as almost comparable to Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto not believing that the Nazis intended to exterminate them when the evidence was all around them that this is what is happening. That it simply, it is unacceptable that one cannot accept this view of reality because it's too dark.
I think that's actually a very good analogy, and I think you're right. I think you're right. And I wonder how we can get through to those people. It seems a more reasonable task to get through to high-level people who might be laboring under some kind of cognitive distortion. I
Right.
see.
Now,
Go on.
here's the thing. Well, perhaps part of it, okay, the Jews is a little different, but I'm going to put them aside for a minute. What McCarthy and the generals have in common is they cannot accept that Trump is a Russian agent and maintain their institutional loyalties. That
Right.
is, as generals, these men have a duty to support the President of the United States,
Yeah.
that it would be unacceptable for them to say something that would imply that they know he is a traitor. For McCarthy, if you want to remain a member of the right, as it were, a credentialed member, you can't say Russiagate was not a hoax. It was no hoax, okay? This is real. I mean, there's a few that are willing to say it. I was at this meeting in Principles First in Washington, drew about 1,000 people a month ago. But, you know, so Adam Kitzinger spoke there, but he's been thrown out the door, and you know, he's a Trotskyite, no longer a member of the party. If you want to stay a member of the party, you can't say these things, which means you force yourself to say that you believe it otherwise.
Sergei, what do you think?
Well, I was just thinking about Alice in Wonderland. I'm a great fan of Lewis Carroll, particularly when it comes to quotes. But I mean, if we're looking at how to disable the enemy, probably we need first to understand its structure. You know, draw the map. And from Lewis Carroll, I just remember that once the dragon is beheaded, the troops run away. I mean, there are agents and there are people around them, or the people, you know, who've been influenced, had links with Russia historically, and there are people around them who support them because of loyalties, as you describe, etc., political loyalties to the party, political parties, as I know, because I'm myself activist of the Conservative Party, or at least I think myself, trying to save it. There are obviously tendency within political parties to be loyal to the party at the expense sometimes of national interests, unfortunately. So I'm just thinking that, you know, again, going back to the various investigations of Russian influence, I think it's really important, despite all of the current excuses of why we shouldn't reveal, expose some of the political figures in Britain. At least we can start in Britain because we've got at least, you know, Labour Party in charge, so we can do it now before it gets. Is that I mean, I'll just give you an example of how, I mean, we talked about the media, how the media, even mainstream media, not just like Fox News in the US, but even the BBC in the mainstream media in the UK have been kind of under the spell. So we mentioned Aaron Banks, we mentioned Carol Cadwallader. So Carol Cadwallader mentioned Aaron Banks in a TED talk to do with Cambridge Analytica. You know about Cambridge Analytica, so I don't have to explain. Basically, a military grade software, psychometric software was deployed by Cambridge Analytica to weaponize illegally harvested Facebook data on millions of people in order to identify their psychological weaknesses and tailor, how can I say, tailor fake news in their Facebook accounts to make them vote in a way that would favor Brexit. So they talked about rubbish like, you know, Turkey is joining the EU. But basically, because of what Carol mentioned in her TED talk about Aaron Banks and his links with the Russian embassy, not even specifying what those links were, he just said, I don't even want to talk about what Aaron Banks did say or did not say about his links with Russia. Aaron Banks sued her, which was really a slap suit in the High Court in the UK, which did exactly what slap suit is supposed to do. It disabled her writing for about 8 years. And in the meantime, all these people we were talking about in the media, you know, who kind of pro-Brexit, were weaponized against Carol with what I can only describe as kind of Soviet-style character assassination technique. Even including such kind of mainstream figures as Andrew Neil, who was the political editor of the BBC at the time. And I just wanted to, I type so that I make sure that I'm not misquoting anybody. So he called her Catswallop, crazy cat lady, on Twitter, whilst he was political editor of the BBC. And BBC did not apologize. I mean, there were complaints, obviously. They did not apologize. As far as we know, at least from what we know from public sources, Andrew Neil wasn't publicly punished for this. And now he's actually a great supporter of Ukraine. I was recently saw him on the Times, radio talking about all that. But I mean, my personal, before I move on to bigger things, Andrew Neil, I knew that he was not a very, how can I say, tidy character. Because when I worked for the HSBC, he was our public speaker. And he basically just stole a story from John Major. So he said that he had an interview with President Yeltsin, and he asked President Yeltsin to describe in one word what the situation in Russia was. And Yeltsin said, good. Said, okay, what about 2 words? Not good. But it actually was John Major's story. He just nicked it. I mean, if you're a journalist, you don't. And I knew that because I went to an event with John Major, and he said that he told the story to an audience at the dinner. So and I confronted Andrew Neil, and Andrew Neil refused to admit that he'd stolen from John Major, saying, "Oh no, John Major never said anything original in his life." He emailed me back. So I mean, he's that kind of journalist, and he was at the top, of the BBC as political correspondent. So what happened after? So when Andrew Neil was doing this on Twitter, at the same time, there was this huge abuse online, Carol, and there was this. In the end, UNESCO published this report called "The Chilling: Global Trends in Online Violence Against Women Journalists," which basically they researched of how much abuse there was on Carol Cadwalladr at the time. And I just got some figures here. So they found 10,400 separate instances of obvious abuse against Carol Cadwalladr on Twitter. It was all collected by researchers, which comprised 2.1 million English language tweets between December 2019 and 2021. And they basically said that sexist and explicit abuse represented 40% of obvious abuse, and personal attacks category about 21%. And what's interesting was that when we interviewed this guy called Mr. Sachs, I can't remember his first name, for the podcast, who used to be the head of the Estonian intelligence service. He said that he is absolutely confident that the Russian intelligence orchestrated that bot campaign, that it wasn't just ordinary people, that most of it came from Russian operations. It's basically what I'm trying to say is that there are lots of people. Some of the bloggers will know that, for example, from the early days of Mr. Nolobin, this Russian diplomat who is kind of one of the chief characters in the podcast. The Russian embassy tried to build a map of online personalities and bloggers to support their narratives. So they hosted events. They were making friends with these people, and we also know that some of the bloggers actually received cash from the Russian embassy, but they were really the minority, even amongst this populist bloggers. But I think once the key personalities are exposed for the cash they've taken, whether they're bloggers or politicians, for the donations they've taken, I think the whole it will be very damaging to this kind of house of cards of populism.
Well, if that were true, then Trump making off with dozens and dozens and dozens of boxes of top secret files would have.
Yeah, but we don't know what those files been used for. I mean, if there is a link because they're all posing as great patriots, but in fact, they actually represent a foreign state. So how can you be a patriot and be an agent of a foreign state? I mean, it's kind of going in the right direction in terms of how can I say, what some of you have described at the very beginning of our conversation. What Trump is actually doing for Russia, in fact, but. I think once we dig into his financial deals and being more vocal about his financial dealings, Trump's dealings, and also get the British authorities, whilst Labour is still in charge, really push them towards, because the trouble is that they're really afraid about opening the can of Brexit. That's what I hear from people, my friends who are close to the British government. They're really afraid because they will be then accused of politicizing the whole thing. Sorry, I even tried to write it down because I know, because getting very emotional, I'm going to lose my train of thought. So I think people also that the whole thing about the validity of the Brexit vote, they don't want to open this whole thing again, and also I think that the powers that be don't want to be accused of shaming ordinary people for their naivety and lack of education, because from one hand, people obviously may take it wrongly, but secondly, I think people, if they realize they've been duped, people normally tend to educate themselves. They will try to educate themselves. It's not what powers that be want. I mean, educated people are much more difficult to manipulate. And I think, powers that be don't want that. I have a friend in American military, quite high up, and he thinks that in America, once all these things about Trump deals and his sex with underage women alleged, and everything, going to come out, and links with Russia and all the kinds of things, and how this election campaign has been conducted, it's going to be a huge sort of sense of disillusionment and despair amongst people who support him now, ordinary people who never dealt with Russia, never took bribes, and that there will be a huge kind of emotional thing. And he says that, he also told me that part of the reason of why America found itself where it is now is that after the war, actually in Europe was the same thing. There was a realization that there was a real push for education in the 50s and 60s, and a level of education gone up. But then among certain circles in government, there was this concern that left-wing people were getting far too educated. They were getting all this cheap, reading classics. There were all these cheap books produced, and they could afford to buy them. And so they tried to dumb it down a bit through television, through game shows, etc. I mean, that was his theory.
I think that just happened through television game shows. I don't think anyone intended it. Andrea, am I seeing your hand up?
No, you're just seeing me
Nodding.
shaking my head.
Yeah.
And I think there's when I shared my thoughts of what I wanted to say during this podcast with my team at Sergei in the Westminster Spy Ring podcast, one of the producers circled my point about why Putin loves the podcast.
Yeah, I want to hear about that.
I said, what? Why? What do you mean? Well, I think because that Putin, with all his what's the word? Incursion. When the flights quickly crosses through the border into NATO. Yeah. So how he likes to test the response.
Yeah. NATO
response, etc. And I think what basically my podcast shows is that a response to me, somebody who saw a little bit of Putin's plan, trying to warn the British authorities, Western authorities, and the response was pretty feeble. So I would expect him to basically lie back in his chair with a glass of champagne and very much enjoy this podcast. Because it's about how feeble we are. It kind of, it validates his worldview in a way.
Yeah, unfortunately, so much is validating his worldview. So much is validating his disdain for democracy and for the citizens' capacity to make wise democratic choices. So much is validating. Well, I sent you that essay about Project Russia, in which the authors explicitly say we can prove how worthless how democracy is by manipulating it. And I thought that was, if this is an authentic document and if this is authentically what they were trying to do, I thought that was terribly demoralizing to read, that we're demonstrating proof of concept. And I don't know exactly beyond what we've done already, how we can harden democracies against this while still remaining open societies.
Well, my view is that we should really weaponize the rule of law whilst we still have it, because you can see what Trump is doing now with, trying to muscle the courts, etc. in the US. I mean, at least in Europe, we still have it. I think we should really try to disregard. I think, who was that wonderful late senator who was chairman of the Senate's Intelligence Committee, when she was publishing, finally, after I think about 7 years, that amazing research report into it was called the CIA torture report,
Yeah, it was
and she said, there's never a good
Feinstein.
time. There is never a good
Feinstein.
time. But that's the strength of our democracy. We have to admit our mistakes, stand up, say, we've been wrong, and this is our weaknesses. But we
Well,
do that so we can say,
chair?
never again.
Who was the chair of the Senate inquiry into interference in the 2016 election? It was Marco Rubio. And now look at him.
Well, power corrupts.
Yeah, it does.
The situation, may I?
Yeah, please.
Okay, look. It's been known for a long time that democracies are open to subversion by demagogues. This is it were, the underlying storyline behind Thucydides' Peloponnesian War book. And so the Athenians were doing okay so long as they had Pericles to lead them. But after he goes away, and then they become susceptible to demagogues like Alcibiades and so forth, who leads them to disaster. And so democracies only work if there are statesmen who can lead them. If not for Churchill, Britain would have lost World War II, because they would have agreed to a peace when Hitler offered it in June 1940. And frankly, Roosevelt's domestic policies were very mistaken, but as a war leader, he did do what had to be done. And Lincoln, who was not an aristocrat, but nevertheless fulfilled that role. Somehow, I mean, I think what needs to be done is that we need to find a way to get to the aristocracy, if you will, the real aristocracy, by which I don't mean titled people necessarily, although they could have a title or they could not have a title, but the people who have that relationship to society, and get them to step up here, because they're not. Where's the Bush family right now?
Where are the Obamas?
They haven't endorsed Trump, but there's no leadership here for a patriotic political movement that will reverse this, and that's what's needed.
Robert, you took out words from my mouth, because I was just thinking about the Queen. She's supposed to be, sovereign in Britain, supposed to be the last kind of safeguard against dictatorship. And talking about Russian interference, I mean, the issue of foreign interference, I think, ceased to be a political issue as soon as it came under the new National Security Act 2023, I think. So it's now been included, which means is that it's a national issue rather than a political one. And what about sovereignty? So if foreign interference leads to a government which came to power due to foreign influence, presumably then sovereign would have direct role in countering that. I mean, that's from the British perspective, I think. And yeah, so I think there's an issue of sovereignty as well.
Do we have any other questions for Sergei? Or any other comments about what to do to solve this problem? Because we can't allow this to continue. There's Arun, you've got your hand up.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments. First of all, I think one needs to consider that a lot of Americans, in fact, the majority of Trump's voters, his MAGA base, they don't see Russia as an enemy. I mean, they admire Russia. They like Vladimir Putin. You know, he's seen as he's defending conservative traditional values, and
But he is seen that way because they don't know anything about it, and they've been
well,
exposed
that's
to
right.
Western
But
propaganda.
listen, for Trump's voters, for the MAGA base,
Mhm.
the enemy is, and Trump is, and JD Vance, they're actually categorical on this. It's domestic. It's
Yes.
blue America. And they're going after them right now. We see at Columbia University, and it's only beginning. And so that's the enemy for a lot of Americans. You know, the United States is a very deeply divided society. But also, you know, if you go back to Trump's first term, whenever I go to the United States, you know, I'd be at my mother's house. MSNBC is on 24/7, my mother's. And they were, you know, their evening hosts, they were hammering away at the Russia issue. Rachel Maddow was like, every time she was just going on and on about it. And, you know, I would hear it and it, you know, I thought she was good, but you know, personally, I could not keep up with a lot of the names and stuff. But there was a campaign against her, and not just by the to Trump and the MAGA people, but also people like Glenn Greenwald, what's his name, Glenn Greenwald, people like that. They were going after her and trying to discredit her, and then there was the rollout of the Mueller report, and the way Bill Barr, where he spun it, it seemed for a lot of people, including Democrats, that it proved that there was not collusion between Trump and
People
Russia.
did not understand that was not a counterintelligence investigation. It was a criminal investigation.
Right, but
and the media failed to explain this and the difference.
Well, if you're talking about the media, who you're talking about? I mean, first of all, most Americans don't, listen, if you look outside the conservative media ecosystem, Fox and all that, people, I mean, listen, among the people I know in my educational age cohort in the United States, nobody watches television.
I didn't say they did.
Excuse me?
I didn't say they did.
That's right.
I don't think it's correct that, look, the polls have been taken. The 70% of Americans support Ukraine, 10% support Russia, 20% don't care. Trump was actually swimming upstream politically to support Russia. And that's why during the election, instead of taking a clear position, he just said, if I was president, they never would have attacked. He didn't say, when I become president, I will make Ukraine submit. No, he didn't say that at all. But that's it's just that there's no leadership here. And even okay, Trump got 49% of the vote. Of it, perhaps 10% were real true blue or red or whatever MAGAs who want to do the whole thing.
More than that.
Another 20% were people who detested the Democrats and Latinx and transgenderism and blah, blah, blah. Okay. And the other 20% were price of eggs is too high. So it is not true that Americans are marching to annex Greenland right now. It just simply isn't so. That's a minority position that people are just accepting this madness, because also they see no virtue in the only alternative that is being offered them, which are people who want them to use the word Latinx instead of Latino. I mean,
right. But the culture wars were pretty important in the last election. I mean, that's what really decided it. That's what gave Trump his 49.9% of the popular vote.
Yes, I think so.
Well, sure, but culture war of not liking genderism and identity politics and the whole mix that the Democrats are offering is not the same as wanting to dissolve the Western alliance and the international system of free trade and getting rid of the Constitution.
Yeah.
But somehow people didn't realize Trump was serious about that. And I don't know why they didn't.
Because they take him seriously, but not literally.
Larissa?
They take him seriously, but not
No, I
literally.
said Larissa.
Huh?
Thanks, Claire. I guess, yeah, I wanted to make a broad comment about something that kind of has come to mind during this conversation. One is this idea of like the insiders club that Sergei brought up, and the sense that like once you're a member, then the club and the members of the club are going to try to, like not attack you and call you out for the things that you do that are reprehensible. And I think that's part of the problem with the United States, is in the sense that like we did elect Trump. And there's a lot of, it seems like it's very endless to go back and forth about the other people who are not the people that you share a worldview with. But the fact of the matter, I mean, I feel responsible for Trump's presidency, even if I voted for someone else, even if I live abroad. And so that's part of it. And I think the other side that's the most really menacing and terrifying is just the way that this Russian influence, it didn't appear on January 20th. It has been working for so long, and it has survived things like the Mueller report. It has survived so many people who have called it out. And so information, like it really feels like it doesn't have power anymore. It doesn't mean that it's not important, but like information doesn't do anything by itself anymore. And I think like I don't have the answer to what exactly we need, but I also feel like we're facing a moment where like all of the things that we used to use to be able to persuade, to be able to like, that had power in a political context, something has changed so dramatically. They don't work the same way that they used to. And we're like grasping at air to kind of figure out what other ways to maneuver. But I think it's about other ways of maneuvering.
Can I? It's very interesting, but at the same time, the country is still very divided, isn't it? I mean, that hasn't really changed. You don't suddenly have 80% for Trump in America, do you? So, I mean, I'm just thinking, when Trump was not the president, this division works in his favor. But now that he is president, this division will work in our favor, presumably. So, and I would just want to throw maybe finally a spanner in the works in terms of the next election. Because I think because of this division and Putin's tendency not to invent narratives, but to amplify certain narratives in order to shift incrementally public opinion or government policy in this and that direction. You correct me if I'm wrong, because this is something that I only know from very few sources, so I'm not quite sure what is accurate, what's not. But there was something that I watched about 2016. Apparently, a secret letter was delivered, probably from the CIA or NSA, I'm not quite sure, to the White House, to Obama, saying that the Russians threatened, there was intelligence that they were basically working to hack electoral machines in the US. And the Americans then had a conversation with the Russians, warning them against it, saying, do not do this. But also then, if you remember, there were some reports later on which confirmed that Russians hacked. Now, I'm in a system, in your American electoral system of colleges, where the vote can be, the election can be decided by one or two states. And each state has a separate voting IT infrastructure, as far as I remember. So if you can only hack one or two, it might have a result. I'm just wondering, with the Trump suspending cyber defense operations against Russia, whether this opens an opportunity for the space for the vacuum, for the Russian cyber vacuum, to hack the machines and make sure that because Trump would welcome that
100%
interference. And if something happens, he can always say, I didn't know anything about it, as the Russians.
Yeah.
100%. liable.
It's catastrophic. I haven't spoken to anyone yet who doesn't tell me it's worse than you can imagine.
And also, you know, with Chinese working on a supercomputer, I mean, I remember talking to somebody, well, not talking, I asked the question afterwards, but I was in a dinner with a former head of GCHQ who basically said, Oman, you know, who basically said, Professor Oman, and he said that once the Chinese succeed and if they're first in developing quantum computer, then all of the codes we have, they go out of the window. And that, of course, will be shared with Russia and whatever. So autocracy will win. So just to put it out there as well.
I do think autocracy is going to win.
Multi-dimensional problem.
Autocracy is going to win if we just roll over and say we can't do anything. We just have to wait until some kind of 9/11 event convinces people that things are really bad. We have to be able to think of better things to do than just observe this in horror. I'm sorry, Ms. Admin, I've forgotten your name and I'm so embarrassed that I've forgotten it that I haven't called on you, even though I've seen your hand has been up for a bit. So that's not fair to you.
Okay, no problem, no problem. Again, I reel back a while. There was the question of people sort of voting for Trump, whether they really believed he would do what he said he would do, like, oh, I'll be a dictator on day one, etc., etc. And his attempted destruction of the country and the rule of law. I think there's a similarity here, I think, to the Kennedy assassination, in that people, you know, intelligent people from all across the spectrum will believe anything that spares them from having to face the fact that their own government is working against them. And I think that's what we have here. We've had it in the UK as well, and people, you know, you can't blame them for it. Nobody wants to even contemplate that possibility that their own government is working against them. But there's been decades of denial, and if you see the whole maintenance of, or the attempted maintenance of, an official narrative, I think we're maybe the same here. And like Sergei was saying about Brexit, it was proven in court that the referendum was so unreliable that had it been legally binding, it would have been struck out. And that it's that sort of reality that, again, the media and a lot of people either don't know about or just cannot contemplate because it's too awful.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, just to explain to American audience. So what you're saying is that when we say legally binding, meaning that, you know, elections, probably some of you know, some of you don't. Elections are legally binding.
Yes.
And
yeah,
that referendum was advisory. So the same strict rules as apply to elections to see what was the actually legal result of election, what could have been an illegal result of an election. Those rules do not apply to advisory referendums. And the Brexit referendum was an advisory. So it didn't have the same legal structure. Protecting the result.
I would differ on that, because I was reading the court case of this, and the sticking point was that there was no legal mechanism for reversing it because it was advisory. But there was an option to put the brakes on Article 50. And it was proven that had it been, you know, had it been for real, it would have been struck out. But because there was no legal mechanism, it was assumed that people would act honourably and not go with something that had been proven corrupt. but they did. That was Theresa May. But again, it's that, I don't know, that inability or fear of having to grapple with a reality that, that your own government is maybe working against you.
On top of it, it sounds like the plot of a very bad movie.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that's a bigger obstacle than you would think. I think that it sounds so much like a bad novel or a bad movie makes people think it cannot be true.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. So I don't know where you would go from there, for to change anything. But I think that this, oh, it can't possibly happen here. No, it can't possibly be true, because that would be too bad. I don't know where you'd start.
And because I think also people think someone would have stopped it if that were true.
Yeah. Yeah. When with Kennedy, they said, oh, someone would have spoken out. Loads of people did, but they were ignored, or worse. It depends who's really running the show.
Yeah. All right. It's all deeply, deeply disturbing. And Sergei, I appreciate very much your coming to speak to us about it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Would you
It's lovely to meet everybody as well.
Would you like to summarize once again what you're working on now? Because I think it's important.
Oh, thank you. Well, if anybody wants to contribute as well, chip anything, I will be very grateful. Because kind of for me, as I become older and slower, I don't know whether I should shooting myself in the foot saying that, but for me, it's kind of choice between either working in a restaurant or doing this research. And I think for public interest, it's better for me if I do this research. So I'm completing my main and going hopefully to Buckingham for my doctorate with the same topic, Western investments in oppressive regimes and how it damages our national security. And I will sort of dig into, whilst I'm in Buckingham, I will dig into case studies, from Russia, from other countries, which will also make it interesting from the intelligence perspective. But at the moment, it's all about just asset managers, those funds that we all invest when we try to maybe put something for some, young people for their retirement or for the future of their children. And we invest in a sustainable fund, but instead it basically says that, we expect it to be those resources to be put to good use, being a sustainable fund, but instead asset managers invested in the Putin regime. So I'm just looking at a case study under the current EU legislation, SFDR, how so far we identified 400 funds, but I think there are more because some of the specific Russian funds also fell under sustainable category, believe it or not, before the invasion. And after the invasion, that Russian category was suspended. So we're just trying to find those funds individually at the moment. And then I will weaponize my network of my contacts. Some of them work for the Insider. You probably know it's a group of investigative journalists working together with Billingcat to help me to dig due diligence on specific holdings, so specific Russian companies in terms of their history of corruption, closeness of the regime, and also how they fit within the war machine. And it's kind of, it's part of it is going to be part of my thesis, part of it's going to be published independently. And thankfully, because this data has been very difficult to come by, Morningstar, which is this company in Chicago, which houses all the fund data, has been trying to say, oh, it's too cumbersome for us to do this. We'll waste a lot of time. It's impossible to access. But as soon as I got the Economist magazine involved, they immediately released the data. So it was very good. So the Economist is interested, and also in the UK, this publication Byline Times. So it's going to be a joint kind of reveal by the two publications, Economist and Byline Times, and they'll be quoting my research. Hopefully, fingers crossed. We're working on it.
And I will put the link to the GoFundMe campaign.
Thank you.
When I put up the podcast based on this discussion, it will have that link. And there's also a link to it in the announcement that I sent out, the first announcement that I sent out. So
thank you. Thank you very much.
Everyone should support this research because no one else is going to do it. And that's another problem. The demise of investigative journalism, for all the financial reasons we all know so well, is another reason we're not getting as much information about this as we ought to be getting. So I think it's important work. All right, if no one has any further questions, we will draw this to a close, but I see that Andre has a further question.
Yeah, right. A small one to finish up. Why did Vance, Trump, and Musk, yeah, boost the AfD in Germany? I
Because
mean, doesn't make any sense from
Yes,
an
it does.
American perspective.
Well, not from an American perspective, but it makes perfect sense in terms of our operating assumption.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, that's some of the best evidence there is. Sergey, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't really know Germany that well. I mean, what's happening there? So I'm afraid to say something that is going to sound clumsy. But
Well,
obviously, fundamentally, yes, populism, and from what Anne Applebaum says in terms of, we have to look at it as autocracy Inc. So it's all linked up. And also, of course, the big Russian grand strategic objective of undermining NATO and splitting everything. They tended, from geopolitical perspective, they always tended to deal with weaker states on a bilateral basis. But here's kind of extension of that. So they would focus on one particular country and try to destabilize it, and then, yeah.
And I see a Robert with his hand up again. Robert Alberts, it's your turn.
Robert, you're on mute.
Yeah, you're muted, Robert.
Still on mute.
There we go.
There you go.
Well, I am a trumpet player, so being muted sometimes is part and parcel of the job. Anyway, the one word I have not heard in this discussion is racism. And a lot of this took a real downhill climb after Obama was elected president. For all his good and bad, there is a thing that, he was an African American who got elected. And a lot of people have said, no Obama, no Trump. But it's just, it hits at the heart of the basest, lowest, meanest of Americanism is this whole thing, the whole political and economical implications of racism and keeping certain people oppressed. And it is my core belief, and I forget who asked, Andre asked about, their Trump, Pence, and or not Pence, but Vance and Musk supported the AfD in Germany. Well, it's obvious. I mean, that's, the good old United States of America is where Hitler and Mussolini got a lot of their ideas for how to suppress peoples and all that sort of thing. And I think aside from, the greed, the oligarchy part of it, the one thing that hasn't been really addressed is the whole racist issue. I mean, even Democrats, they demonized Al Green for speaking out. Even people that I was shocked who did that.
Yeah.
But it's like, why?
I think
He was speaking his
nonsense.
mind.
The United
Supposedly,
States
we're
used
still
to
in
be
a
a
free
lot
country.
more racist.
Pardon?
The United States used to be much more racist than it is today. There's no question.
Also,
And we had no Trump. There's something else going on here. Yes, there's
No, but
always
I'm
been
saying, but
racist, but we used to be far more racist than we were. I mean,
well, that's when they say they want to make America great again. And I'm not arguing your point. I'm just saying that it's, after Obama, the whole Pandora's box got released. The Southern Poverty Law Center has said that what Trump, whether he got elected or not elected in 2016, brought all of that back into the mainstream.
Robert, maybe what you mean is the backsliding, in human rights and liberal values.
Well, no, I agree, even though he's
Mm.
shaking his head. I mean, the other Robert, no, it's always been there, and it's always worse. But
I don't think that has anything to do with Russia's influence. I think that's really authentically ours.
Well, yes, but it made it sure easy for Russia to appeal to that whole right wing, redneck base.
Sure. I mean, Russia notoriously uses what's there and exacerbates it.
Oh
But I
yeah.
think whatever the issue was, they would have exploited it. But I think that's very much authentically ours, even though, I mean, I've never met more racist people than the Russians. I don't think they implanted that in our society. That goes
No,
back.
no, no, no. I'm not saying it. And I agree with you. It's taking advantage of it. And there have been times when racism was, you know, worse, but it's like it's really coming on the upstream again, because I believe that they just couldn't stand that another person of color, and let alone a woman of color, in the White House, and they were going to do everything. I mean, I was optimistically pessimistic, or I should say cautiously hopeful, but I knew they were going to get Trump back in the White House. I just knew it by any means possible. They were gonna do everything they could.
I think that the change that makes Trump possible is some well-conceived Russian information war maneuvers, but particularly exploiting the potential of social media, which
Yeah,
has
I do
created
too.
a post-truth environment.
I do too.
That's the situation. Racism, such as it exists, is a piece of political terrain within the American political landscape, but it is certainly not a larger factory than it was, when Roosevelt was president. I mean, hello, or when Johnson was president, or you name any particular time in the past, there was much more racism around than there is today. But I think the disintegration of the American mind. Okay, there was this book written a while ago called "The Closing of the American Mind." Someone needs to write a book called "The Disintegration of the American Mind."
Have you read Adam Garfinkel's work on it? We've published quite a bit of it at Cosmopolitan Globalist.
No, I
He's written
haven't.
a long
But
series about this, which is really, really very good, about what social media has done to our minds.
by the way, there's a British TV series called "The Undeclared War," done in 2021, which is a Russian information war attack on the UK that almost succeeds. It's worth watching.
Really? Has anyone
Yes.
watched it? No?
Well, in the US, it's available on Peacock. It was originally done on a British series. It's a mini series, 4 episodes. So, but it's quite interesting. They almost completely destroy the country using an information war offensive.
Interesting. All right. Well, it's a big problem, and if anyone has any insights about how to solve it and you want to share them with me, you've got my email address, because we can't just allow this to happen without doing anything. We've got to figure out how to crack this one.
Thank you so much again for having me.
Sergei, I appreciate it very much. It was great to have you. I wonder if there's a little emoji here to applaud.
Thank you. No, applaud to you, and I think maybe we should have an update in some time, just to see whether we got anywhere with our attempts at fairness
everyone else seems to know how to applaud.
and justice. I think exposing crimes is very important, because if you remember, at the end of the Second World War, there were still, as Berlin was taken, half of it was Russian forces, Soviet forces, half of it was Western allies, and there were still housewives in Berlin, and destroyed Berlin, who wouldn't believe what their own regime was doing, and they had to be forced into seeing the concentration camps. So I think the crimes have to be exposed for everyone to believe.
They do, and it's very hard to figure out how to expose them to people who won't believe the thing you say. All right, with that happy note, thank you for joining, everyone, and wait a second. People are still exchanging notes. People are sending you, Robert, their email address.
What?
Robert, there's a message for you from Robert Albert that says, "Robert Zubrin, here's my email address."
Oh, okay. I have to find it.
And Xavier Lewis says, "Thank you so much. Excellent, but very depressing." And Midge says, "Still listening, but must have my hands busy. So thanks all. Seriously, very informative. Check out the Led by Donkeys YouTube page for a video titled Heil Tesla. Thank you all. I learned a lot and enjoy it. Trump could be a Kremlin asset and unaware of it. All they had to do was appeal to his greed and vanity. Yeah, exactly. And I think, oh, and Midge says, when Claire asked who doubts Trump's governance is influenced by Russian agents, I don't doubt it now. I'm still a pretty recent believer. But I'm still a pretty recent believer, partly because it is so bad movie-ish. Explanations of how pedestrian the influence really is, like something naturally falling out of Trump's real estate career, helps make it seem less ridiculous. That's a useful, helpful comment. Thanks, Midge.
Mhm.
Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.